Number 1. Louise Woodward. Louise Woodward was just 19 years old when she left her small hometown of Elton in Cheshire, England, filled with dreams of experiencing life in America and earning money while caring for children as an au pair through the EF Au Pair Agency in 1996. She seemed like the perfect candidate for the program, a cheerful teenager from a respectable working-class family where her father was a truck driver and her mother worked as a dental nurse. And she had successfully completed her schooling and was looking for adventure before settling into a more permanent career path. The Eapen family of Newton, Massachusetts, seemed equally ideal as hosts, with Dr. Sunil Eapen working as an anesthesiologist at Boston's Brigham and Women's Hospital and his wife Deborah, an ophthalmologist, balancing demanding medical careers while raising their 2 young sons, Matthew, who was just 8 months old, and Brendan, who was 2.5 years old. Louise arrived in the summer of 1996 and moved into the Eapen home, a comfortable residence in an affluent suburb where she was given her own room, a weekly stipend of $115, and responsibilities that included caring for the children, doing light housework, and having evenings and weekends mostly free to explore Boston and make friends with other au pairs in the area. The arrangement seemed to be working reasonably well despite some minor tensions, with Deborah Eapen later acknowledging that Louise sometimes seemed more interested in going out with friends than staying home with the children, and there were moments when Deborah felt Louise was not as attentive or enthusiastic about childcare as she had hoped, but nothing that seemed alarming enough to terminate the arrangement. On February 4, 1997, everything changed in the most devastating way imaginable when Louise called 911 at approximately 5 p.m., telling the emergency dispatcher that baby Matthew was having difficulty breathing and appeared to be unconscious. When paramedics arrived at the Eapen home within minutes, they found 8-month-old Matthew Eapen unresponsive, not breathing on his own, and showing signs of severe neurological distress. Louise told the responding EMTs and police officers that she had been playing with Matthew, tossing him gently in the air to make him laugh, when he suddenly became fussy and she put him down for a nap around 3 p.m., and when she checked on him about 2 hours later, she found him gasping for breath with his eyes rolled back. Matthew was rushed to Children's Hospital Boston, where doctors discovered he had a fractured skull, a subdural hematoma, which is bleeding between the brain and skull, and retinal hemorrhages in both eyes, injuries that medical experts determined were consistent with violent shaking and blunt force trauma rather than any accidental fall or gentle play. The medical evidence painted a horrifying picture of what Matthew had endured in his final conscious moments, with Dr. Patrick Barnes, the chief of neuroradiology at Children's Hospital, testifying that the baby's injuries could only have resulted from severe trauma equivalent to a high-speed car accident or a fall from a second-story window, and the fresh nature of the injuries indicated they had occurred within hours of Matthew's collapse, pointing directly to Louise as the only caregiver present during that time frame. Matthew Eapen died 5 days later on February 9, 1997, never having regained consciousness, and Louise Woodward was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, thrust into a legal battle that would become one of the most internationally publicized trials of the 1990s. The case immediately captured massive media attention on both sides of the Atlantic, with British newspapers portraying Louise as a naive young girl being scapegoated by the American justice system, while American media focused on the grieving parents and the horrific death of an innocent baby. Louise maintained her innocence from the beginning, insisting that she had never harmed Matthew and that he must have been injured in some other way, perhaps from a previous undiagnosed condition or an accident that occurred earlier, but prosecutors built a compelling case around the medical evidence, the timeline of events, and Louise's own statements. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Gerald Leone, argued that Louise had become frustrated with Matthews crying on the evening of February 4th, had violently shaken him and possibly slammed his head against a hard surface in a moment of rage, and then waited nearly 2 hours before calling for help, during which time Matthews' condition deteriorated to the point of irreversible brain damage. During the trial, which began in October 1997 at Middlesex Superior Court in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the jury heard testimony from multiple medical experts who explained in graphic detail the extent of Matthews' injuries, including a 2.5-inch skull fracture that showed evidence of both old and new bleeding, suggesting that Matthew may have been injured on previous occasions as well. The defense team, led by attorney Andrew Good and assisted by Barry Scheck, who would later gain fame as part of O.J. Simpson's defense team, argued that Matthews' injuries could have resulted from a previous injury that suddenly manifested, a theory known as rebleeding from an old subdural hematoma, and they painted Louise as a caring teenager who was being wrongly accused because someone had to be blamed for this tragedy. The defense called their own medical experts who testified that the injuries could potentially have occurred days or even weeks before Mathews' collapse. And they suggested that Mathew might have been injured during his birth or in the care of someone else, though prosecutors effectively countered this by pointing out that Mathew had been examined by his pediatrician just weeks before his death and showed no signs of previous trauma. The trial became a media circus with cameras in the courtroom broadcasting the proceedings live, and public opinion was sharply divided between those who believed Louise was a cold-blooded killer who had murdered an innocent baby in her care, and those who thought she was a scapegoat being sacrificed to satisfy grieving parents and an overzealous prosecution. On October 30, 1997, after deliberating for nearly 27 hours over 3 days, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree murder, having rejected the first-degree murder charge but finding that Louise had indeed caused Mathews' death through malicious actions. Louise showed no emotion as the verdict was read, standing stoically while her parents sobbed in the courtroom gallery, and she was immediately taken into custody, facing a mandatory sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years under Massachusetts law. However, in an extraordinary and controversial move just 9 days later, Judge Hiller Zobel reduced Louise's conviction from second-degree murder to involuntary manslaughter and reduced her sentence to time served, which was 279 days, essentially freeing her immediately. Judge Zobel explained in his written decision that while he believed Louise had caused Mathews' death through rough handling or shaking, he did not believe the evidence supported a finding of malice or intent to harm, which is required for a murder conviction, and he felt that involuntary manslaughter, which requires only reckless or negligent behavior resulting in death, was the more appropriate charge given the circumstances. The judge's decision sparked outrage among many Americans who felt that justice had been denied to Mathew Eapen and his family, with Deborah and Sunil Eapen releasing a statement expressing their devastation and disbelief that their son's killer was being set free after spending less than a year in custody. The prosecution appealed Judge Zobel's decision, arguing that he had overstepped his authority by essentially overruling the jury's verdict. But the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court upheld the judge's decision in June 1998, ruling that while the judge's actions were unusual, they were within his legal authority and were supported by the evidence presented at trial. Louise Woodward returned to England in June 1998 after posting bail during the appeal process, and when the conviction was upheld as involuntary manslaughter, she was not required to return to the United States to serve any additional time. The case left lasting scars on everyone involved, with the Eapen family facing not only the loss of their son but also intense public scrutiny and criticism from some quarters who suggested they had been negligent parents for leaving their infant in the care of a teenage au pair while they pursued demanding careers. Louise Woodward, now Louise Elkis after marrying in 2013, has maintained her innocence for over 2 decades and has largely avoided public attention, working as a dance teacher in her hometown and rarely speaking about the case that defined her teenage years and continues to divide opinion. The case also prompted significant changes in the au pair industry, with agencies implementing more rigorous screening procedures, better training for host families about realistic expectations and warning signs of caregiver stress, and clearer guidelines about working hours and responsibilities to prevent au pairs from becoming overwhelmed. The medical evidence presented during the trial contributed to ongoing debates within the medical community about shaken baby syndrome, with some experts questioning whether the classic triad of symptoms, subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhages, and brain swelling, always indicates intentional abuse or whether some cases might result from other causes, though the mainstream medical consensus continues to support the diagnosis of abusive head trauma in cases like Mathew Eapen's. The cultural impact of the Louise Woodward case extended far beyond the courtroom, highlighting deep differences between American and British attitudes toward criminal justice, with British observers often viewing the American system as excessively punitive and American observers seeing the British response as minimizing the severity of a child's death. For the Eapen family, no legal outcome could ever bring back their son or erase the nightmare of February 4, 1997, when they entrusted their baby's care to a teenager who, whether through intentional violence or catastrophic negligence, caused injuries that no infant could survive, forever changing multiple lives and leaving questions that continue to haunt everyone touched by this tragedy more than 25 years later. Number 2. Janepsy Carballo. Janepsy Carballo was a 35-year-old mother living in Hallandale Beach, Florida, trying to balance her work schedule at a local restaurant with raising her 3 young children in a modest apartment complex where neighbors looked out for each other and childcare was often a shared community responsibility. In October 2022, Janepsy found herself in a situation familiar to countless working parents when her regular childcare arrangements fell through and she needed someone trustworthy to watch her children while she completed her shift at work. She turned to a woman she knew from the neighborhood, a seemingly friendly and reliable person who had interacted with the children before and who offered to babysit for the evening, an arrangement that seemed perfectly safe and reasonable given their acquaintance and the desperation many working parents feel when faced with last-minute childcare needs. The babysitter, whose name has been kept out of most public records to protect the identity of the juvenile victims, was someone Janepsy had trusted enough to allow into her home and around her children on previous occasions. And there had been no previous incidents or red flags that would have warned of the horror that was about to unfold. On the evening of October 22, 2022, Janepsy left her 3 children, including her 4-year-old daughter, her 6-year-old son, and her 8-year-old daughter, in the care of this babysitter while she went to work her scheduled shift, expecting to return home several hours later to find her children safe, fed, and ready for bed just as they had been on previous occasions when this arrangement had worked without incident. What happened during those hours while Janepsy was at work would become every parent's absolute worst nightmare. A betrayal so profound and disturbing that it shook the entire community of Hallandale Beach and sparked intense discussions about how parents can possibly protect their children when the very people they trust turn out to be monsters in disguise. According to the subsequent police investigation and criminal charges filed by the Broward County State Attorney's Office, the babysitter subjected the children to horrific physical and sexual abuse during the hours they were under her care, with the specific details being so disturbing that prosecutors were careful about what information was released to the public given the ages of the victims and the need to protect their privacy and psychological well-being during the legal process. When Janepsy returned home from work later that evening, she immediately sensed that something was wrong, with her children appearing traumatized, withdrawn, and exhibiting behavioral changes that no parent wants to see in their kids. And when she gently questioned them about what had happened while she was gone, the children began disclosing abuse that was so shocking and unexpected that Janepsy initially struggled to process what she was hearing. With extraordinary courage for children so young, the victims provided consistent and detailed accounts of what had been done to them, describing acts of physical violence and sexual assault that were later corroborated by medical examinations and forensic interviews conducted by specially trained professionals at the Children's Advocacy Center who work with young abuse victims. Janepsy immediately called the Hallandale Beach Police Department, and officers responded to her apartment within minutes, finding 3 deeply traumatized children who needed immediate medical attention and psychological support. The children were transported to Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital, where they underwent comprehensive medical examinations that documented physical evidence consistent with their disclosures of abuse, including injuries that could only have been inflicted intentionally and recently, confirming that the abuse had indeed occurred during the babysitting period. Detectives from the Hallandale Beach Police Department's Special Victims Unit launched an intensive investigation, interviewing the children using trauma-informed techniques designed to minimize additional harm while gathering the evidence needed for prosecution. The babysitter was arrested within days of the initial report and charged with multiple counts of sexual battery on a victim under 12 years old, lewd and lascivious molestation, and child abuse, charges that carried potential sentences totaling multiple life terms in prison if convicted on all counts. The arrest shocked neighbors and community members who had known the babysitter and never suspected she could be capable of such heinous acts, highlighting the disturbing reality that child predators often hide in plain sight, presenting themselves as trustworthy and caring individuals while harboring dark impulses that they unleash when given unsupervised access to vulnerable children. As the case moved through the criminal justice system, prosecutors in the Broward County State Attorney's Office worked closely with the victim's mother and child advocacy professionals to ensure the children received appropriate therapeutic support while building a strong case for trial. The children's consistent and detailed accounts of the abuse, combined with medical evidence and forensic findings, created a compelling body of evidence that prosecutors believed would lead to conviction, though they also had to consider the potential trauma of having such young children testify in court against their abuser. Florida law provides special protections for child victims in sexual abuse cases, including the possibility of closed-circuit television testimony to avoid direct confrontation with the defendant and the admission of certain statements made to trusted adults or medical professionals as exceptions to hearsay rules, recognizing that young children often cannot withstand the stress of traditional courtroom testimony. The defense attorney representing the babysitter faced an extremely difficult case given the strength of the evidence and the number of victims, and while every defendant has the right to legal representation and a fair trial, the facts of this case left little room for alternative explanations or reasonable doubt. In 2023, after months of legal proceedings and negotiations, the babysitter accepted a plea agreement rather than proceeding to trial, pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a lengthy prison sentence that would ensure she could never again have access to children and would spend a significant portion of her remaining life behind bars. The exact terms of the plea agreement were not fully disclosed to protect the victim's privacy, but court records indicate the babysitter was sentenced to multiple decades in prison with no possibility of early release, a sentence that reflected the severity of her crimes and the lasting impact on her young victims. For Janepsy Carballo and her 3 children, the legal resolution brought a measure of justice but could never undo the trauma inflicted during those hours in October 2022. And the family faced a long road of therapy and healing as they worked to overcome the psychological and emotional damage caused by this betrayal of trust. The case highlighted critical issues around childcare safety and the challenges working parents face in finding trustworthy care for their children, particularly in communities where formal licensed daycare is expensive or unavailable and parents must rely on informal arrangements with neighbors, friends, or acquaintances who may not have undergone background checks or any formal vetting process. Child safety experts recommend that parents always conduct thorough background checks on any potential caregiver. Check references from other families. Look for red flags such as reluctance to allow supervision or monitoring. Trust their instincts if something feels off about a caregiver's behavior or demeanor. Maintain open communication with children about appropriate and inappropriate touching. Create an environment where children feel safe disclosing uncomfortable situations. And install monitoring systems like nanny cams when possible to provide oversight even when parents cannot be physically present. The trauma experienced by child abuse victims can have lifelong effects including post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulty forming trusting relationships, struggles with intimacy and boundaries, depression and anxiety, and various behavioral and emotional challenges. But with appropriate therapeutic intervention, family support, and time, many survivors are able to heal and build fulfilling lives despite their experiences. Janepsy Carballo's quick action in believing her children and immediately reporting the abuse likely prevented further victimization and ensured that the perpetrator was held accountable, demonstrating the critical importance of listening to children when they disclose abuse rather than dismissing their accounts as fantasy or exaggeration. The Hallandale Beach community rallied around the family after the case became public, with neighbors, local businesses, and community organizations offering support, donations, and resources to help the family cope with medical expenses, therapy costs, and the disruption to their lives caused by the investigation and legal proceedings. This case serves as a sobering reminder that child predators exist in every community, regardless of socioeconomic status, race, or neighborhood reputation, and that parents must remain vigilant about who has access to their children while also recognizing that even with all reasonable precautions, determined predators can sometimes infiltrate families' trust circles through manipulation, deception, and exploitation of parents' vulnerabilities and needs. The 3 children in this case showed remarkable courage in disclosing what happened to them and cooperating with the investigation despite their young ages and the trauma they endured. And their bravery ensured that their abuser was removed from society and prevented from harming other children, making them heroes in their own right even as they continue their journey of healing and recovery with the support of their mother who believes them, protects them, and fights for their well-being every single day. Number 3. Sherin Mathews. Sherin Mathews was just 3 years old when she was adopted from an orphanage in Nalanda, India, by Wesley and Sherin Mathews, a couple from Richardson, Texas, who already had a biological daughter and wanted to expand their family by giving a home to a child in need. Sherin had been born with developmental disabilities and failure to thrive, conditions that had left her smaller and more vulnerable than typical children her age, and she required special care, patience, and medical attention that the Mathews family claimed they were prepared to provide when they brought her to their comfortable home in an upscale Richardson neighborhood in June 2016. The adoption should have represented a new beginning for Sherin, a chance to grow up in a loving family with resources, education, and opportunities that would never have been available to her in the Indian orphanage system. But instead, her adoption would lead to her death just 15 months later under circumstances so disturbing that they shocked the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area and sparked international outrage. On October 7, 2017, Wesley Mathews called the Richardson Police Department at approximately 8 a.m. to report that his 3-year-old adopted daughter Sherin was missing from their home at 900 block of Sunningdale Drive, claiming that he had sent her outside at 3 a.m. as punishment for not drinking her milk, and when he returned to check on her 15 minutes later, she was gone. The story immediately struck investigators as suspicious because what reasonable parent sends a 3-year-old child outside alone in the middle of the night as punishment, particularly a special needs child who was small for her age, nonverbal or minimally verbal, and would have been terrified and disoriented in the darkness. Wesley Mathews, a 37-year-old information technology professional, told police that Sherin had feeding issues and refusing to drink milk was a recurring problem. So he had taken her outside to the alleyway behind their home as a disciplinary measure, waited 15 minutes, and found her missing when he went to retrieve her. The Richardson Police Department immediately launched a massive search effort, deploying K-9 units, helicopters, volunteers, and search and rescue teams to comb through the neighborhood, nearby creeks, parks, and open areas, desperately hoping to find Sherin alive despite the increasingly unlikely odds with each passing hour. Wesley's wife, Sherin Mathews, who worked as a nurse, claimed she had been asleep during the incident and knew nothing about Sherin being sent outside or going missing until Wesley woke her in the morning, a claim that many found difficult to believe given that the couple's biological daughter was also in the home and the house was not so large that a commotion would go unnoticed. As the investigation intensified, detectives began finding significant inconsistencies and problems with Wesley Mathews' account, including the suspicious delay between Sherin's alleged disappearance at 3:15 a.m. and Wesley's call to police at 8 a.m., a 5-hour gap during which their daughter was supposedly missing, but they took no action to find her or alert authorities. Police also discovered that Wesley Mathews had a history of concerning behavior related to Sherin, with Child Protective Services having received reports of possible abuse, and the family had been under some level of scrutiny before Sherin's disappearance, though no action had been taken to remove her from the home. The investigation took a dark turn on October 22, 2017, when a cadaver dog located Sherin's body in a culvert beneath a road approximately half a mile from the Mathews family home, a discovery that transformed the case from a missing child investigation into a homicide inquiry. Sherin's small body had been placed in the culvert and covered with debris in what appeared to be an attempt to conceal her death, and the location was not somewhere a 3-year-old child could have reached or hidden herself, clearly indicating that someone had placed her there after her death. Wesley Mathews was arrested and charged with felony injury to a child, and as the evidence mounted, he eventually changed his story, abandoning the tale about sending Sherin outside as punishment and admitting to a very different sequence of events on the night of October 6th into the morning of October 7th. In his revised account, Wesley claimed that Sherin had once again refused to drink her milk around 3 a.m., that he had tried to force her to drink it in the garage away from the rest of the family, and that while physically assisting her with drinking, she choked and began to cough, and when he removed the bottle, she was no longer breathing and he could not revive her. Wesley claimed that he panicked when he realized Sherin was dead, fearing that he would be blamed for her death and that his biological daughter would be taken away by Child Protective Services. So instead of calling 911 and trying to save Sherin if any chance remained, he decided to hide her body in the culvert and concoct the story about her wandering off. This new account, while more plausible than the original story, still painted a horrifying picture of a father who valued his own interests over his daughter's life, who chose concealment over potentially life-saving medical intervention, and who allowed an entire community to search for a child he knew was already dead. The medical examiner's autopsy report was unable to determine a definitive cause of death due to the advanced decomposition of Sherin's body after 2 weeks in the culvert, but the report noted evidence consistent with homicidal violence and could not rule out suffocation, strangulation, or other forms of trauma. Prosecutors charged Wesley Mathews with murder, arguing that regardless of whether Sherin died from choking, suffocation, or other abuse, Wesley's actions in forcing her to drink, his failure to seek immediate medical help, and his concealment of her body demonstrated a depraved indifference to human life that constituted murder under Texas law. Sherin Mathews was also arrested and charged with child abandonment and endangerment for allegedly failing to check on her daughter's welfare and abandoning her daughter with Wesley knowing that he was abusing the child. Charges that suggested prosecutors believed she had knowledge of abuse in the home and failed to protect Sherin. The case drew intense media scrutiny and public outrage, particularly from the Indian and Indian American communities who were horrified that a child adopted to give her a better life had instead been killed by her adoptive parents. And there were calls for reforms to international adoption processes and better post-adoption monitoring. In March 2019, Wesley Mathews accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to a reduced charge of injury to a child by omission in exchange for prosecutors dropping the murder charge, and he was sentenced to life in prison, though under Texas law he would be eligible for parole after serving 30 years. The plea agreement was controversial, with many people feeling that Wesley should have faced trial on the murder charge and received a harsher sentence. But prosecutors explained that the decomposition of Sherin's body made it difficult to prove the exact cause of death beyond reasonable doubt, and the plea ensured Wesley would serve significant prison time rather than risk acquittal at trial. Sherin Mathews' charges were dismissed in 2019 after prosecutors determined they lacked sufficient evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that she knew about the abuse or had abandoned Sherin. Though the dismissal did not mean prosecutors believed she was innocent, only that they could not meet the burden of proof required for conviction. The biological daughter of Wesley and Sherin Mathews was removed from their custody and placed with relatives, spared from growing up in a home where her adopted sister had been killed and covered up. The case prompted discussions about the adequacy of post-adoption support services and monitoring, particularly for international adoptions involving children with special needs who may be more vulnerable to abuse and neglect. Child welfare experts noted that while the vast majority of adoptive parents are loving and committed to their children's well-being, there is a small percentage who are unprepared for the challenges of parenting adopted children, particularly those with developmental delays, attachment issues, or medical needs, and some adoptive parents, when overwhelmed, resort to abuse rather than seeking help from support services. The Sherin Mathews case also highlighted the failure of multiple systems that should have protected her, including Child Protective Services, which had received reports of concerns but did not remove her from danger, medical professionals who may have seen signs of abuse during appointments, and the adoption agency that placed a vulnerable special needs child without adequate preparation of the adoptive parents or follow-up monitoring. For those who knew Sherin during her brief life in Texas, she is remembered as a beautiful little girl with a shy smile who deserved so much better than the fate she received at the hands of the people who were supposed to love and protect her. Wesley Mathews remains incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System, where he will spend decades behind bars contemplating the death of the daughter he failed in every possible way. While Sherin's story serves as a tragic reminder of the vulnerability of adopted children and the critical importance of thorough vetting, preparation, and monitoring of adoptive placements to ensure that children are truly going to safe and loving homes rather than into situations where they will suffer abuse and death. Number 4. Alexis Avila. Alexis Avila was an 18-year-old single mother living in Hobbs, New Mexico, doing her absolute best to provide for her infant son while navigating the overwhelming challenges of young parenthood without the support systems that many new mothers take for granted. In January 2022, Alexis found herself in desperate need of reliable childcare so she could work her job at a local business and earn the money necessary to support herself and her baby boy, who was just 6 months old and completely dependent on adult caregivers for every aspect of his survival and well-being. Through connections in her community, Alexis was introduced to a woman who presented herself as an experienced babysitter and childcare provider, someone who claimed to love children and who had references from other families who had used her services, references that Alexis had no reason to doubt given the woman's friendly demeanor and apparent competence when interacting with the baby during their initial meetings. The babysitter, whose identity has been protected in some media reports due to ongoing legal proceedings and the sensitive nature of the case, agreed to watch Alexis' son during her work shifts, and the arrangement began in early January 2022 with what seemed like a normal childcare situation where Alexis would drop her son off in the morning and pick him up in the evening after completing her work shift. For several weeks, the arrangement appeared to be working adequately, with the babysitter providing care during the day and returning the baby to Alexis each evening, though Alexis later reported that there were occasionally concerning signs such as the baby seeming excessively tired, fussy, or showing minor injuries like bruises that the babysitter would explain away as normal accidents from bumping into furniture or playing too vigorously, explanations that Alexis wanted to believe because finding alternative childcare would have been extremely difficult and expensive. On February 10, 2022, Alexis dropped her 6-month-old son off with the babysitter as usual before heading to work, expecting to pick him up later that evening just as she had done dozens of times before. But this time would be different in the most horrifying way imaginable. According to subsequent police reports and criminal charges filed by the Hobbs Police Department and the Lea County District Attorney's Office, the babysitter subjected the infant to brutal and sadistic abuse throughout the day while he was in her care. Abuse so severe that it caused life-threatening injuries requiring immediate emergency medical intervention. The specific details of what the baby endured that day are almost too disturbing to describe, but court documents indicate the infant suffered multiple skull fractures, severe brain trauma, broken ribs, internal bleeding, and other injuries consistent with violent shaking, striking, and possibly being thrown or slammed against hard surfaces, injuries that medical experts testified could only result from intentional infliction of extreme force rather than any accidental fall or normal handling of a baby. When Alexis arrived to pick up her son that evening, the babysitter initially tried to act as though everything was normal, but Alexis immediately noticed that something was terribly wrong with her baby, who was listless, unresponsive, and showing obvious signs of severe distress including vomiting, inability to focus his eyes, and what appeared to be seizure activity. Alexis demanded to know what had happened, and the babysitter provided vague and inconsistent explanations, first claiming the baby had fallen while playing, then suggesting he had choked on food, then changing the story again to say he had fallen down some stairs, stories that made no sense given that a 6-month-old baby cannot walk or play independently, and the injuries Alexis could see were clearly more severe than any simple fall could explain. Without waiting for further explanations, Alexis grabbed her son and rushed him to Covenant Health Hobbs Hospital, the local emergency room, where medical staff immediately recognized they were dealing with a case of severe child abuse and activated protocols for treating pediatric trauma victims. The emergency room physicians worked frantically to stabilize the baby, treating him for traumatic brain injury, skull fractures, and internal injuries while simultaneously notifying the Hobbs Police Department that they had a suspected abuse victim who needed investigation and protection. Detectives from the Hobbs Police Department's Criminal Investigations Division arrived at the hospital and began interviewing Alexis about what had happened, and she told them about the babysitter, the pickup that evening, the baby's condition, and the inconsistent stories the babysitter had provided. Officers were immediately dispatched to the babysitter's residence to conduct an interview and investigate the scene where the abuse had allegedly occurred. The babysitter initially denied any wrongdoing, claiming the baby had simply been clumsy and accident-prone that day, but her stories continued to change and contradict each other under police questioning, and investigators noted that her demeanor was oddly calm and unconcerned for someone whose child care client had just been rushed to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. The investigation intensified as detectives obtained medical records, interviewed Alexis extensively about the babysitter and the care arrangement, and consulted with pediatric abuse specialists who reviewed the baby's injuries and confirmed they were absolutely inconsistent with accidental trauma and clearly indicated intentional abuse. The 6-month-old baby was transferred to a larger pediatric trauma center in Lubbock, Texas, about 110 miles from Hobbs, where specialists could provide more advanced care for his traumatic brain injury and other injuries, and doctors informed Alexis that her son faced a long and uncertain recovery with possible permanent neurological damage, developmental delays, and ongoing medical needs resulting from the abuse he had suffered. The babysitter was arrested on February 11, 2022, just one day after the abuse occurred, and charged with child abuse resulting in great bodily harm, a first-degree felony under New Mexico law carrying a potential sentence of up to 18 years in prison. As the investigation continued, detectives discovered additional concerning information about the babysitter, including previous complaints from other families about rough handling of children, though those complaints had never resulted in criminal charges or formal action that would have prevented her from continuing to offer childcare services. Prosecutors in the Lea County District Attorney's Office worked to build a strong case for trial, gathering medical evidence, expert testimony, and documentation of the babysitter's changing stories and suspicious behavior, while also preparing for the possibility that the victim's young age and severity of injuries might make this a difficult case for a jury to hear given the emotional nature of child abuse prosecutions. The baby spent several weeks in the hospital undergoing multiple surgeries to relieve pressure on his brain, repair his skull fractures, and address his internal injuries, and Alexis remained by his side throughout his hospitalization, dealing with the trauma of knowing her son had been tortured by someone she had trusted and facing the financial and emotional burden of caring for a severely injured child, while also dealing with guilt and self-blame that many parents feel in such situations, even though the abuse was not their fault. In the months following the abuse, the baby began a slow recovery process involving physical therapy, occupational therapy, and ongoing medical monitoring, and while he survived the attack, doctors confirmed that he would likely face developmental delays, possible cognitive impairments, and other long-term effects from the traumatic brain injury he sustained. The Babysitters case proceeded through the New Mexico criminal justice system with multiple pretrial hearings, evidence disputes, and legal arguments about the admissibility of medical expert testimony and the defendant's statements to police. In late 2022, after months of legal proceedings, the babysitter accepted a plea agreement, pleading no contest to the charges in exchange for a negotiated sentence that would spare the baby and his mother from the trauma of a trial while ensuring the perpetrator received significant prison time. Under the terms of the plea agreement, the babysitter was sentenced to 15 years in the New Mexico Department of Corrections, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, and she would be required to register as a child abuser and would be prohibited from ever working with children again. The sentence was controversial, with some community members and child advocates arguing it was too lenient given the severity of the baby's injuries and the permanent damage inflicted, while others felt it was appropriate given the challenges of prosecuting child abuse cases and the certainty that a plea agreement provided compared to the risks of trial. For Alexis Avila, the resolution of the criminal case brought some measure of justice but could never undo what happened to her son or restore the carefree infancy he should have experienced. The case highlighted the dangerous gaps in childcare regulation and oversight, particularly for informal childcare arrangements that exist outside the licensed daycare system, where parents often have no reliable way to verify caregivers' backgrounds, check for previous abuse complaints, or ensure that the person watching their child has any training or qualification for the responsibility they are undertaking. Child safety experts recommend that parents always conduct thorough background checks including criminal history and child abuse registry searches, check multiple references from other families, observe the caregiver interacting with the child multiple times before leaving them alone, install cameras or monitoring systems if possible, make unannounced visits to check on care quality, maintain open communication with children old enough to speak about what happens during care, and trust their instincts if anything seems wrong about a caregiver's behavior or the child's condition after being in that person's care. The babysitter in this case is currently serving her sentence in a New Mexico correctional facility, where she will remain incarcerated until at least 2037, while the little boy she abused continues his recovery surrounded by his mother's love and the support of medical professionals and therapists, working to help him overcome the trauma inflicted during those hours in February 2022 when he was supposed to be safe in a caregiver's protection but instead became a victim of unconscionable cruelty and violence. Number 5. Maria Solis. Maria Solis was a hardworking mother of 4 living in Houston, Texas, juggling multiple jobs to keep her family fed, housed, and cared for in one of America's most expensive cities, where the cost of living continues to rise, while wages for working-class families struggle to keep pace. In the summer of 2019, Maria faced a situation that millions of American parents know all too well when her regular childcare arrangements fell apart due to her usual babysitter moving out of state, and Maria desperately needed to find someone reliable who could watch her children during her evening work shift at a local restaurant where she waited tables to supplement her daytime income. Through a referral from a coworker, Maria was introduced to a woman named Priscilla Torres, a 28-year-old Houston resident who advertised herself as an experienced childcare provider and who seemed friendly, responsible, and genuinely fond of children during their initial meeting. Priscilla had no formal certification or licensing as a childcare provider, but she claimed to have years of experience watching children for various families in the Houston area, and she provided Maria with names and phone numbers of other parents who had supposedly used her services and could vouch for her reliability and competence. Maria, faced with limited options and the immediate need to maintain her work schedule or risk losing her job, decided to hire Priscilla to watch her 4 children, aged 18 months, 3 years, 5 years, and 7 years, during her evening shifts from approximately 6 p.m. to midnight several nights per week. The arrangement began in July 2019, and for the first several weeks, everything seemed fine with Priscilla arriving on time, the children apparently content when Maria returned home, and no obvious signs of problems or concerns that would have warned Maria of the nightmare brewing beneath the surface. Priscilla Torres, unbeknownst to Maria Solis, had a history of concerning behavior around children, including previous accusations of harsh discipline and rough treatment from families who had quietly stopped using her services without reporting their concerns to authorities, a pattern that allowed Priscilla to continue offering childcare despite being unsuitable and potentially dangerous. On August 29, 2019, Maria left her 4 children in Priscilla's care as usual when she departed for her evening shift, kissing each child goodbye and reminding them to behave for Miss Priscilla, completely unaware that this would be the last normal moment her family would ever experience. According to the subsequent investigation by the Houston Police Department and testimony provided during criminal proceedings, sometime during the evening hours while Maria was at work, Priscilla became enraged at the 18-month-old toddler, Maria's youngest child, a little boy who was fussy, crying inconsolably, and resisting Priscilla's attempts to put him to bed for the night. Rather than employing patience, understanding, or appropriate childcare techniques to soothe the distressed toddler, Priscilla responded with violence, violently shaking the child, striking him, and according to later medical evidence, possibly slamming him against furniture or walls in a rage-fueled attack that lasted several minutes. The 3 older children witnessed at least part of the attack on their baby brother and were traumatized by seeing him hurt and crying while being unable to protect him or stop what was happening. Priscilla realized the baby was seriously injured, with his breathing labored, his body limp, and his eyes rolling back in his head, clear signs that he needed immediate emergency medical care. But rather than calling 911 immediately and potentially saving his life, Priscilla instead spent precious minutes trying to decide what to do, apparently weighing whether she should seek help or attempt to cover up what had happened. Eventually, Priscilla did call 911, but the delay of approximately 20 to 30 minutes between the initial injury and the emergency call significantly reduced the baby's chances of survival and recovery. When paramedics from the Houston Fire Department arrived at Maria's home, they found the 18-month-old boy unresponsive, not breathing adequately on his own, and showing signs of severe head trauma including visible swelling and bruising. The child was rushed to Texas Children's Hospital, one of the nation's premier pediatric medical centers, where trauma surgeons and neurologists worked desperately to save his life. But the injuries to his brain were too severe, and despite every intervention medical science could provide, the little boy was declared brain dead on August 31, 2019, just 2 days after the attack. Maria Solis, who had been called from work the moment paramedics arrived and had been keeping vigil at the hospital, had to make the unbearable decision to remove her son from life support and watch him die, all while trying to process the incomprehensible reality that the woman she had trusted to care for her children had murdered her baby. The autopsy conducted by the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office revealed that the toddler had died from blunt force trauma to the head causing catastrophic brain injury, and the medical examiner classified the death as a homicide, meaning the injuries were intentionally inflicted by another person rather than resulting from any accident or natural cause. Priscilla Torres was arrested on September 2, 2019, and charged with capital murder, the most serious criminal charge in Texas which carries either life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty if prosecutors choose to seek it. During police interrogation, Priscilla initially denied harming the child, claiming he had fallen while playing or had somehow injured himself while she was momentarily distracted. But investigators quickly determined these stories were inconsistent with the medical evidence and the timeline of events. The 3 surviving children, traumatized by witnessing their brother's death and the violence inflicted by someone who was supposed to protect them, were interviewed by specially trained forensic interviewers at the Children's Assessment Center in Houston, and their accounts confirmed that Priscilla had violently attacked their baby brother while they watched in horror. The case against Priscilla Torres was strong, with medical evidence, witness testimony from the surviving children, forensic analysis of the scene, and Priscilla's own inconsistent statements all pointing to her guilt in the murder of an innocent toddler whose only offense was crying and being fussy, as all babies sometimes are. Harris County prosecutors prepared for a capital murder trial, intending to seek life in prison without parole rather than the death penalty given the circumstances of the case, and they worked with victim advocates to support Maria Solis and her surviving children through the traumatic process of pursuing justice. In 2020, as the case was preparing to go to trial, Priscilla Torres accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to murder in exchange for prosecutors reducing the capital murder charge and agreeing to a sentence of 40 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice with the possibility of parole after serving half the sentence, though parole would not be guaranteed, and she would have to demonstrate rehabilitation and remorse to ever be released. The plea agreement spared Maria Solis and her children from having to testify at trial and relive the trauma of that night, and it ensured that Priscilla would spend at minimum 2 decades behind bars for her crime. During the sentencing hearing, Maria Solis gave a victim impact statement describing the devastating loss of her youngest child, the trauma experienced by her surviving children who now suffer from nightmares and anxiety, the financial burden of funeral expenses and ongoing therapy costs, and the profound betrayal she felt at having trusted someone who turned out to be a killer. Priscilla Torres showed minimal emotion during the sentencing hearing, offering only a brief apology that many observers found inadequate and insincere given the magnitude of what she had done. The case had ripple effects throughout Houston's childcare community, with parents becoming more cautious about informal babysitting arrangements and demanding better oversight and regulation of unlicensed childcare providers who operate outside the formal daycare system. Texas law requires childcare facilities caring for more than a certain number of children to be licensed and regularly inspected, but individual babysitters working in private homes with small groups of children face minimal regulation or oversight, creating a dangerous gap where abusers can operate with impunity until they severely harm or kill a child in their care. Maria Solis became an advocate for stronger childcare regulations and better protection for children in informal care arrangements, speaking at community meetings and working with local legislators to propose reforms that would require background checks, abuse registry searches, and basic training for anyone offering childcare services, even in informal settings. Her advocacy helped inspire the passage of local ordinances in several Texas jurisdictions requiring registration and basic vetting of home-based childcare providers, though enforcement remains challenging and gaps in the system still exist. For Maria's 3 surviving children, now teenagers and preteens, the trauma of that night in August 2019 remains a constant presence in their lives, affecting their ability to trust adults, their comfort with being separated from their mother, and their general sense of safety in the world. Therapy and family support have helped them process some of the trauma, but the murder of their. Number 6. Christopher Jackson. Christopher Jackson was a 42-year-old man living in Baltimore, Maryland, who presented himself to his community as a friendly neighbor, a helpful person who enjoyed being around children, and someone parents could trust when they needed childcare assistance in the close-knit working-class neighborhood where families looked out for each other and informal childcare arrangements were common. Jackson had lived in the same Baltimore neighborhood for over a decade, and many families in the area knew him casually from encounters at local stores, community events, and around the neighborhood where he was often seen being friendly and chatting with residents. In 2018, Jackson began offering babysitting services to families in his neighborhood, presenting himself as someone with experience caring for children and positioning his services as an affordable alternative to expensive licensed daycare facilities that many working families simply could not afford. What the families who hired Christopher Jackson did not know was that he had a previous criminal record including arrests for assault and disturbing the peace from years earlier, though he had never been convicted of crimes involving children and therefore was not on any sex offender registry or child abuse watch list that parents could have checked to vet him. Several families in the neighborhood began using Jackson's babysitting services in late 2018 and early 2019, and for months the arrangement seemed to work adequately, with Jackson watching children in his apartment for a few hours here and there while their parents worked shifts, ran errands, or handled other responsibilities. The parents whose children Jackson watched had no idea that their babysitter was secretly a predator who was grooming their children and waiting for opportunities to abuse them when he felt confident he would not be caught. In May 2019, a 7-year-old girl who had been in Jackson's care told her mother something deeply concerning about her time at the babysitter's house, using language and describing acts that no 7-year-old should know about unless they had been exposed to inappropriate sexual content or behavior. The mother, horrified by what her daughter was saying, immediately took the child to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where she could be examined by medical professionals and interviewed by specially trained forensic specialists who work with child abuse victims. The examination and interview revealed that the 7-year-old girl had been sexually abused by Christopher Jackson during babysitting sessions, and she provided detailed, consistent accounts of what he had done to her, accounts that were consistent with the physical evidence found during the medical examination. The mother immediately reported the abuse to the Baltimore Police Department, and detectives from the Child Abuse Unit launched an investigation into Christopher Jackson and his babysitting activities. As detectives began investigating Jackson, they discovered he had been watching multiple children from different families in the neighborhood, raising the alarming possibility that the 7-year-old girl might not be his only victim. Detectives reached out to other families who had used Jackson's babysitting services and requested that they speak with their children about their time in Jackson's care. And these conversations led to the devastating discovery that Jackson had sexually abused at least 5 children between the ages of 4 and 9 years old, with each child providing accounts of abuse that occurred during babysitting sessions when Jackson had unsupervised access to them. The children's accounts included descriptions of Jackson showing them pornography, touching them inappropriately, forcing them to touch him, and in some cases committing what legally constitutes rape of a minor, acts so disturbing that even experienced detectives and prosecutors were shaken by the scope and nature of the abuse. Christopher Jackson was arrested on June 15, 2019, and charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor, child rape, displaying obscene material to minors, and other charges that together carried potential sentences of hundreds of years in prison if convicted on all counts. During the execution of a search warrant at Jackson's apartment, investigators discovered disturbing evidence including child pornography on his computer, hidden cameras that he had used to record some of the abuse, and journals in which he had written about his sexual interest in children and his plans to gain access to more victims through babysitting. The evidence painted a clear picture of a calculated predator who had deliberately positioned himself as a babysitter specifically to gain access to vulnerable children he could abuse. The Baltimore County State's Attorney's Office assigned a team of experienced prosecutors to the case, and they worked closely with child advocacy professionals to support the victims and prepare them for the possibility of testifying at trial if the case proceeded that far. The victims, ranging from age 4 to 9, underwent extensive forensic interviews, medical examinations, and therapy to help them process the trauma of the abuse and prepare to participate in the justice process. Maryland law provides special protections for child victims in sex abuse cases, including the possibility of closed-circuit testimony to avoid direct confrontation with the defendant and the use of victim advocates who can support children throughout the legal process. The case against Christopher Jackson was overwhelming, with multiple victims providing consistent accounts, medical evidence confirming abuse, digital evidence of child pornography and recordings, and Jackson's own writings demonstrating his predatory mindset and intent. Faced with this mountain of evidence and the certainty of conviction if the case went to trial, Jackson's defense attorney began negotiating a plea agreement that would spare the victims from testifying while ensuring Jackson received a lengthy prison sentence. In December 2019, Christopher Jackson pleaded guilty to multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor and child rape in exchange for prosecutors agreeing to a sentence of 75 years in prison with no possibility of parole, essentially a life sentence given Jackson's age at the time of sentencing. The plea agreement required Jackson to admit in open court exactly what he had done to each victim, forcing him to take full responsibility for his crimes in a way that provided some measure of validation and closure for the victims and their families. During the sentencing hearing, several of the victims' parents provided impact statements describing how Jackson's betrayal had shattered their trust, traumatized their children, and left lasting damage that would require years of therapy and support to overcome. The parents also expressed guilt and anguish over having trusted Jackson and left their children in his care, though victim advocates and the judge made clear that Jackson alone bore responsibility for his crimes and that the parents had been deceived by a skilled manipulator who deliberately exploited their trust. Christopher Jackson showed no remorse during the sentencing hearing, offering only a perfunctory apology that the judge characterized as insincere and self-serving. The judge, in imposing the 75-year sentence, noted that Jackson was a dangerous predator who had methodically planned his crimes and shown no regard for the profound harm he inflicted on innocent children, and the lengthy sentence was necessary to protect society from someone who would certainly reoffend if ever given the opportunity. Christopher Jackson was transported to a Maryland maximum security prison where he will spend the rest of his natural life. and he has been placed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes, since child sex offenders face significant violence and abuse from other inmates, even in prison. For the 5 identified victims and their families, the resolution of the criminal case brought some justice but could never undo the abuse they suffered or erase the trauma that will affect them for years to come. The victims underwent extensive therapy using trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and other evidence-based treatments designed to help child abuse survivors process their experiences and develop coping strategies. Some of the victims experienced ongoing behavioral problems, difficulties in school, problems forming trusting relationships, and other effects common among child sexual abuse survivors, though with treatment and family support many eventually showed significant improvement. The case prompted the Baltimore neighborhood where Jackson had operated to implement informal watchdog systems where parents shared information about potential childcare providers and looked out for warning signs of predatory behavior. Though the reality is that skilled predators like Christopher Jackson often show no obvious red flags until after they have already harmed victims. Child safety experts recommend that parents never leave children in the care of adults they do not know extremely well, that they conduct thorough background checks including criminal records and sex offender registry searches on any potential caregiver, that they check multiple references from other families, that they install hidden cameras or monitoring devices if possible, that they maintain completely open communication with children about appropriate and inappropriate touching, and encourage children to immediately report anything that makes them uncomfortable, and that they trust their instincts if anything seems off about a caregiver's behavior or their child's reaction to being in that person's care. The sad reality is that child sexual predators are skilled at identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities in families and communities, at grooming both children and adults to gain trust, and at manipulating situations to gain unsupervised access to victims. While most babysitters and childcare providers are safe, responsible individuals who genuinely care about children's well-being, the existence of predators like Christopher Jackson means parents must remain vigilant and take every reasonable precaution to protect their children from harm. The 5 victims in this case showed extraordinary courage in disclosing the abuse and cooperating with the investigation and prosecution, and their bravery ensured that Christopher Jackson was held accountable and prevented from harming additional children, making them heroes who protected other potential victims even while processing their own trauma. The families affected by Christopher Jackson's crimes continue their healing journey, supported by therapy, advocacy services, and the knowledge that their abuser will never again walk free to harm another child. Number 7. Kelsey Smith. Kelsey Smith was a 23-year-old mother living in Memphis, Tennessee, working as a nursing assistant at a local hospital while trying to provide the best possible life for her 2 young daughters, aged 2 years and 4 years old, in a modest apartment in a working-class Memphis neighborhood. In the fall of 2021, Kelsey faced a childcare crisis when her usual daycare center closed unexpectedly due to staffing shortages and COVID-19-related complications, leaving her scrambling to find alternative care so she could maintain her hospital job, which provided the income and health insurance her small family desperately needed. Through a referral from someone at her church, Kelsey was introduced to a woman named Tamika Henderson, a 31-year-old Memphis resident who advertised herself as a home-based childcare provider offering affordable care for working parents, and who seemed warm, professional, and genuinely interested in providing quality care for Kelsey's daughters. Tamika operated her childcare service out of her home in a Memphis suburb, and she claimed to be watching several other children from families in the area, though she was not licensed as a daycare facility because Tennessee law does not require licensing for home-based providers caring for fewer than a certain number of unrelated children. Kelsey visited Tamika's home, observed the environment which appeared clean and child-friendly with toys, safety gates, and appropriate furniture, and spoke with Tamika about her childcare philosophy, daily routines, and experience, all of which seemed reasonable and reassuring. Kelsey decided to hire Tamika to provide childcare for her 2 daughters Monday through Friday while Kelsey worked her hospital shifts, and the arrangement began in October 2021, with Kelsey dropping the girls off each morning around 7 a.m. and picking them up around 6 p.m. after her shift ended. For the first several weeks, the arrangement seemed fine, with the girls appearing happy and well cared for when Kelsey picked them up each evening, and Tamika providing updates about their days, including what they ate, their nap times, and activities they enjoyed. However, around mid-November 2021, Kelsey began noticing concerning changes in her daughter's behavior, particularly her 4-year-old who had become withdrawn, was having frequent nightmares, showed increased anxiety around strangers, and seemed reluctant to go to Tamika's house each morning, behaviors that worried Kelsey but that she initially attributed to general stress and adjustment issues. Kelsey tried to talk with her 4-year-old about what was wrong, asking if everything was okay at Miss Tamika's house, if anyone had hurt her or made her uncomfortable, but the child was reluctant to discuss it and seemed fearful of getting in trouble or not being believed. On November 29, 2021, Kelsey arrived at Tamika's house to pick up her daughters at the end of her work shift. But something was immediately wrong, with Tamika seeming nervous and evasive, the 2-year-old crying inconsolably, and the 4-year-old showing visible bruising on her arms and face that had definitely not been there when Kelsey dropped them off that morning. Kelsey demanded to know what had happened to her daughters, and Tamika provided vague explanations about the girls falling while playing and having roughhoused with each other. But the injuries Kelsey could see did not match these explanations, and maternal instinct told her that something terrible had occurred. Kelsey took her daughters and left immediately, driving directly to Lou Bonheur Children's Hospital in Memphis where medical professionals could examine the girls and determine the extent of their injuries. The emergency room examination revealed that both girls had injuries consistent with physical abuse, including bruises in various stages of healing indicating that the abuse had been ongoing for some time rather than just occurring that day, and the 2-year-old had cigarette burns on her back and legs that could only have been inflicted intentionally. Kelsey was devastated as she listened to doctors describe the extent of abuse her daughters had suffered, and she immediately called the Memphis Police Department to report what had happened. Detectives from the Child Abuse Division responded to the hospital and interviewed Kelsey about Tamika Henderson and the child care arrangement. And they also conducted age-appropriate forensic interviews with the 4-year-old who was old enough to provide an account of what had been happening at Tamika's house. The 4-year-old disclosed that Tamika had been hitting them with objects including a wooden spoon and a belt when they misbehaved or cried, that Tamika had burned her little sister with cigarettes as punishment for having bathroom accidents, that Tamika had forced them to stand in corners for hours as punishment, and that Tamika had threatened them not to tell their mother about the abuse or else the punishment would get worse. The child's account was heartbreaking and detailed, and it was consistent with the physical evidence documented by medical professionals, creating a clear picture of systematic abuse that had been occurring for weeks. Detectives obtained a search warrant for Tamika Henderson's home and conducted a thorough investigation of the premises, finding evidence of abuse including the implements used to strike the children, photos on Tamika's phone showing the children with visible injuries, and text messages between Tamika and her boyfriend in which she complained about the children being difficult and expressed frustration with caring for them. The evidence clearly demonstrated that Tamika Henderson, rather than being the caring child care provider she had presented herself as, was actually an abuser who had tortured the children in her care while their mother worked to support her family. Tamika Henderson was arrested on November 30, 2021, and charged with 2 counts of aggravated child abuse, a serious felony under Tennessee law carrying potential sentences of 8 to 30 years per count, meaning Tamika faced up to 60 years in prison if convicted on both counts. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Memphis community, particularly among the families of other children who had been in Tamika's care, and police urged any parents whose children had spent time with Tamika Henderson to have their children examined and interviewed to determine if they too had been victims of abuse. This outreach led to the discovery of 2 additional child victims, other youngsters who had been left in Tamika's care and who had also been physically abused, though apparently not as severely as Kelsey Smith's daughters, bringing the total number of confirmed victims to 4 children ranging in age from 18 months to 5 years old. The Shelby County District Attorney's Office assigned experienced prosecutors to build a comprehensive case against Tamika Henderson, gathering medical evidence, testimony from the child victims, digital evidence from Tamika's phone and devices, and statements from parents about their experiences and the injuries they had observed. The prosecutors faced the challenge of building a case strong enough to ensure conviction, while also protecting the young victims from the additional trauma of testifying in open court against their abuser. Tennessee law provides accommodations for child witnesses, including closed-circuit testimony and the presence of support persons during testimony, but prosecutors ideally preferred to secure a plea agreement that would spare the children from having to participate in a trial. In early 2022, as the case was being prepared for trial, Tamika Henderson accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse in exchange for prosecutors agreeing to recommend concurrent sentences of 25 years in prison for each count. meaning she would serve 25 years total rather than consecutive sentences that could have totaled a century behind bars. The plea agreement required Tamika to admit what she had done to each victim and to waive her rights to appeal the conviction or sentence, ensuring finality for the victims and their families. During the sentencing hearing in March 2022, Kelsey Smith provided a powerful victim impact statement describing how Tamika Henderson's abuse had affected her daughters, the nightmares and anxiety they continue to experience, the ongoing therapy they require, and the profound betrayal Kelsey felt at having trusted someone who had tortured her babies. Kelsey also spoke about the guilt she carries for not recognizing the abuse sooner and for having continued to bring her daughters to Tamika's house even after noticing behavioral changes, though she acknowledged with the help of therapy that she was not to blame for Tamika's choice to abuse vulnerable children. The other victims' parents also provided impact statements expressing similar feelings of betrayal, guilt, and anger at what their children had endured. Tamika Henderson offered a brief apology during the sentencing hearing, claiming she had been overwhelmed by childcare responsibilities and had allowed her frustration to overcome her better judgment. But the judge rejected this excuse, noting that millions of childcare providers manage their responsibilities without resorting to burning children with cigarettes or beating them with implements. The judge sentenced Tamika to the agreed 25 years in the Tennessee Department of Corrections, noting that Tamika would be ineligible for parole until serving at least 85% of the sentence under Tennessee's truth in sentencing laws, meaning she would be incarcerated until at least 2043. Tamika Henderson was transported to the Tennessee Prison for Women where she remains incarcerated and where she has reportedly been placed in protective custody due to threats from other inmates who learned of her crimes against children. For Kelsey Smith and her two daughters, the resolution of the criminal case provided some justice but could not undo the trauma they experienced or erase the effects of the abuse. The girls have been in intensive therapy using play therapy, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and other evidence-based treatments designed to help young children process abuse and develop healthy coping mechanisms. The older daughter in particular has struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety, and difficulties trusting adults outside her immediate family, common effects seen in child abuse survivors that can persist for years even with excellent therapeutic intervention. Kelsey was forced to reduce her work hours at the hospital to attend therapy appointments with her daughters and provide the additional care and supervision they needed as they healed, creating financial hardship that was compounded by therapy costs not fully covered by insurance. The hospital where Kelsey worked provided some assistance through their employee assistance program, and the local community rallied to support the family with fundraising efforts and donations of time and resources. The case highlighted the dangerous lack of regulation in Tennessee's home-based childcare sector, where individuals can operate childcare services without licenses, background checks, inspections, or training requirements as long as they stay below certain thresholds for number of children served. Child advocacy groups in Tennessee used the Tamika Henderson case as a rallying point to push for stronger childcare regulations, including mandatory licensing for all paid childcare providers regardless of number of children served, required background checks including criminal history and child abuse registry searches, surprise inspections of home-based childcare facilities, and training requirements covering child development, appropriate discipline techniques, and recognition of signs of caregiver burnout. Some of these reforms have been implemented in certain Tennessee jurisdictions, though statewide comprehensive reform has been slow to materialize due to political resistance and concerns about over-regulating small businesses. Kelsey Smith became a vocal advocate for these reforms, speaking at community meetings and legislative hearings about her family's experience and the need for better protection of children in childcare settings. The case serves as yet another tragic reminder that parents are often forced to make impossible choices in a society that provides minimal support for working families, where quality, affordable childcare is scarce, where wages are insufficient to cover expensive licensed daycare, and where informal arrangements with unlicensed providers are sometimes the only option available despite the risks these arrangements pose. Until American society makes substantial investments in subsidized childcare, professional training and fair compensation for childcare workers, strong oversight of all childcare arrangements, and better support for working families through paid leave and flexible work policies, families like Kelsey Smith's will continue to face impossible choices and children will continue to suffer abuse at the hands of those entrusted with their care.